chapter number 12. Romans chapter number 12. The batteries went out as I walked up. We have had a crazy morning. We had a little water problem this morning. The baptism got out. We baptized the front section of the church, and so if you come up here and kneel in this section, you're probably going to get your knees wet, all right? But there was some water. Just sometimes things like that happen. Me and Barron were here early, and me and Barron were just happy it wasn't us. All right, we'll be using that against some of the other guys for a while. All right, but this past week I got to preach in Southern Ohio. It was a strange place for me to preach because it was like at the center of like a lot of things within 5 to 10 minutes of just a lot of things that have happened in my life over the years. It was like 5 to 10 minutes from where my grandma had gotten killed by a drunk driver. It's really what brought our family to church. It was like 5 to 10 minutes from the grave of our daughter, this place. It was, 5 to 10 minutes from a church that I went to when I was younger that I didn't necessarily get saved at that church, but I got saved going to a revival. And it was all close. And I was, preaching. I was down there in the center of where, like, I could think about all of these things that had gone on in that area where God had me when I was younger. But I was just reminded, like, He's still working there. People got saved this past week where I was preaching, a lady and a man, and so God's still working. And I think this past week when I was gone, there was some who came to Christ here. There was a guy who I shared got saved this week, just out, and about. And so God is still working. Romans chapter 12, verse number 1. We will focus there. He says this. He says, "I beseech," and that word "beseech" means I beg you. If he could be like, he is pleading with people. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice." We'll move through this chapter in a little bit, but I just want you to turn over to Acts chapter number 4. Put a marker there, flip over to Acts chapter 4. I was at this church and I was preaching about missions. And churches, we put on mission conferences. Churches will do big like giving pushes. Churches have all kinds of different things they try to do to get people to do things. And I want to just tell you, in the early part of the book of Acts, they didn't have to do that. Acts chapter 4, verse number 32, Acts 4:32, it reads this: "And the multitude of them believed, were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all." Verse 33, you see this, that's in the early church. One, they have great power and great grace. It was upon everybody, in that early church. He says, verse number 34, "Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the prices of the things that were sold and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made unto every man according as he had need." You see this supernatural thing that happens in the church. They didn't have to do a giving campaign. If you've ever been a part of churches, I'm not good at that. I'm not good at asking a lot of times, or some preachers you would feel like they're begging you for something. I'm not the best at that. I'm like, well, if you don't want to give, then don't give. But you still need to, all right? But that's my heart is like, hey, you don't want to come to church, and just don't come. Like, that. I don't know about you and your family and your life, but at some point you get sick of begging people. If you've ever been a coach, begging the kids to come to teams and to be sold out. If you've ever been a manager at a place, or a boss, you're begging people just to get there. It just gets old. No one was begging anybody in Acts chapter 4 because they were sold out. Some people will come to me sometimes when I preach on giving, and they'll be like, preacher, I think tithing is the Old Testament. I think all this giving stuff's Old Testament. I'm like, fine. Let's just read Acts chapter 4. What are you going to sell? What are you just going to drop all your money in? And they're like, no, I like tithing. 10% isn't so bad. Because when you see this early church, they're radical. I want you to see there's some people here this morning, you're like, man, I wish our church would do that and they would distribute to me. It said they distribute to every man as they had need. That didn't mean that the church supplied all your wants. The new car you want, or it meant, hey, if it was something to sustain life, they were going to distribute that. I think churches sometimes get involved and they're like, hey, someone can't pay their bills, but it's because they spent too much, because they bought too much junk, because they were bad. That's not what this Acts chapter 4 is about. It's as people had needs, the church just came together and said, everything's in common. I just want you to see, they were all surrendered. They were all sold out. No one had to tell them to do this. This is what was in their hearts. You see in Acts chapter 5, we don't need to turn there, but they were beaten and they were commanded not to speak in the name of Jesus, and they just kept doing it. No one had to have like a soul-winning class, a soul-winning campaign. They didn't have to have like, hey, we're going to meet up and we're going to pass mustaches out to people. Now, I just want to tell you, that's not a bad thing. I hope some of you will decide, like, I've never done that. I want to be a part of it. I want to put a gospel tract into somebody's hand. I hope some of your families will come. I hope there'll be some kids who will come. I hope people will come, because I think it's a great opportunity. But they didn't have to do that. They preached the gospel. Why? Because they were surrendered. Stephen surrendered his life in Acts chapter 7. Turn, if you would, with me to Acts chapter 8. A lot of times when you read the Bible, you act like it is just the apostles who were that surrendered. Acts chapter 8, verse number 1. And Saul was consenting unto his death. He's talking about Stephen. Stephen was the first martyr. Stephen was killed. And at that time there was great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout all the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So verse number 1 saying, hey, here's Saul, who will soon be Paul, and he was there when Stephen died. And then the early church, there's just great persecution. People are being killed. Their homes are being taken. Their stuff's being taken. They're hated. And it says there, and they were scattered. Verse number 4. Therefore, they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. So the scattered people went everywhere preaching the word. Go back to verse number 1. And they were all scattered abroad throughout all the regions of Judea and Samaria, except who? It was just whoever was a Christian. It wasn't like it was like the leaders. It wasn't, if we want to look back, it wasn't the preachers of the day. It wasn't the pastors of the day. The congregations or the body of Christ, they were all scattered about, and they were preaching the gospel everywhere. I was thinking about this. No one had to beg them to do that. No one had to say, hey, this is what you got to do. They were just surrendered. They were sold out to Jesus. And so therefore, a lot of things that churches try to manufacture, they didn't have to manufacture because people were just that sold out. They were that surrendered. Turn, if you would, back to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, verse number 1. We'll start reading there again. Remember, he's begging them. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. This hinges everything on the sold-out Christian life. If you don't think it's reasonable, you won't do it. When people ask me to do something that I think is unreasonable, I definitely do not want to do it. If I think something is for me, a lot of times I'm cheap, but I do want to sometimes I'm willing to pay a reasonable price. Some of you, and all of us, I just want to tell you, all of us, how we scale something that's reasonable is different. Some of you, if I said, hey, do you think Starbucks has a reasonable price cup of coffee? Some of you are like, you people are idiots. But some people would say, hey, they think it's reasonable because they like it. Or you would say they're dumb. But if you don't think something is reasonable, I do want to tell you, I do think it's somewhat reasonable. Cody picked me up one day, and we were going somewhere, and he's like, hey, Pastor Mike, I got you a cup of coffee. I was like, oh, thank you, Cody. And we're driving somewhere, and this was fine dining. He got it at McDonald's. And we both had a cup of coffee, and I don't know how long this cup had been sitting at McDonald's, but I sip it. Cody's over there whew, it's more, he's driving. I'm just I'm doing fake sips, and this was one of those. Cody just remembers this because I put the coffee down and he's like, oh, we were getting ready to get out. He's like, I'll get the garbage. And I'm like, no, I'll get it. I'll throw my cup away. And then he picks it up and he's like, this thing's full. You have been acting like you've been drinking it. I've been sipping it. The most tiny sips that anyone could ever imagine. And so sometimes if we think something's reasonable, we're willing to pay the price for it. This is what's crazy to me. That some of you, and I just want to tell you, some of you don't think it's reasonable to serve Jesus with your whole heart. Otherwise, you're like, no, I think he's my all in all. No, if you really believed it was reasonable, you would do it. The reason you don't is because it's not reasonable to you. You haven't come to the point where you're like, it is reasonable that I would just say, Here's my life, Jesus, whatever you want. Whatever direction, whatever path, whatever you would have me to do, it is just reasonable. I just want to give you some thoughts why it is reasonable for us. Romans 5:8 says, "But God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." It is the most amazing and beautiful thing that he saw us as sinners, yet still died for us. Do you know, it's easy to do things for, like, if you like somebody. It's easy to do things because you decide if people deserve something. You're like, do they deserve this? Do they deserve this that I'm bestowing? It's an amazing thing when you are undeserving and he gives you that. Jesus Christ gave us the most amazing gift that we did not deserve. You don't deserve it. I think sometimes why we come to the thinking that it's illogical to give our whole heart in life is that we think somehow along the way that we were good. And I was like a pretty good catch for Jesus. There are people you can think about that with, like I think about Kathy. I was like, man, is she lucky? What a catch. Hey, Dave. Thank you, Dave. You're lucky too. No, I thought, I was supposed to reverse it. But Jesus, there was nothing in me that he should have seen that was good. He shouldn't have died for me. He paid a price for me that I could not pay. There was no way for you to make it in heaven without his death. Why do you come back to this thing that you're worthy? Every religion is about every other religion than true Christianity, and I would even throw false Christianity in this, is about being a good person. If you can be good enough and your good outweighs your bad, then God will accept you. You jump over to any religion and you will find that in that religion, if you are good enough, God will accept you. It is stuck in our minds, and so then when we think that we're a good person, I don't know if you just ever felt this way. This summer we had something like just awesome happen to us where we were like, a family member invited us to go down to stay at a house, and this guy, our family member, just did like odd jobs around at this guy's house. He didn't know about this, but this guy was like a millionaire. He was more than a millionaire. The house we stayed in of his had an elevator. It had like, I forget how many rooms. It was like a $16 million mansion, and we got to stay in it for a week. And as I'm in that house, I'm like, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm like, this is way nicer than anything I've ever experienced. I'm like, even in my mind, I would be like, I don't really deserve this. I don't know if you've like been in like places or things like you're like, this is not, well, one, I always say when I'm in environments like that, I tell Kathy, I was like, these are not my people. I'm like, just the way sometimes we can think when we have tons of money or things like that. But I was so appreciative. I got up like, every morning. I think I would like take a picture of the view that they had. Just every piece in the house. I was like, I just can't imagine. Every day when I got up, I was like, but if you've ever stayed somewhere that you just didn't feel like you should be at. If you've ever just stayed in one of those houses, I've stayed in way more of those, all right, than I've ever stayed in a house where I'm like, I actually lived in a house that people would come over and when Kathy and I first got married, and they would try to take off their shoes, and I was like, please keep them on. The bottom of your shoes are cleaner than the floors in here, all right? I mean, the carpets, we would try to wash the carpets. The floor had like cracks in the floor. We would sweep, and it was the easiest house to sweep. You didn't have to use a dustpan because there were so many cracks in the floor, you would just sweep. And they would all the dust would disappear. But sometimes I would get an attitude like, man, I shouldn't be here. Why am I doing this? Now, it was for ministry. We moved out there and we just found whatever house we could find, and we were just going to live there. But in my mind, I got thinking, and I wasn't going to do anything at that house. I didn't admire that house. I didn't walk into that house. I didn't look out that house's views and be like, look at this, honey. Look how beautiful this is. I don't think I ever said that, especially when it would rain and like the landlord would come and he would just staple plastic to the ceilings. It's one of my favorite stories because he would just staple plastic. He'd be like, I'm going to find this leak, and it would like fill up with these huge like things of water, but somehow when it was coming down through the roof, it would like change color. And I just remember one time, it looked like a big tumor. But I was like, honey, put the thing here, and I'm going to push this, and it's going to drain. And I remember pushing it, and water takes its own route. And it landed all over her head. And I just remember that time because I'll never forget her look on her face. Like, why are we here? Like, why are we living like this? But it's because I didn't think it was reasonable. If you've ever done that, like, when you don't think something's reasonable, you don't admire it, you don't cherish it. Jesus should be something that we just like, it is so reasonable with what he did for me that I would just give all my life to him. I would surrender everything to him. And so if you can just get into your mind, why don't I think it's reasonable? Why will I not completely surrender? It is the most reasonable thing you could ever do. He says this in 2 Corinthians 5:14. He says, "For the love of Christ constraineth us." It's his love. It's amazing that it constrains me. It brings me to this spot of surrender. I think about this for the Christian, if you will read that verse again, Romans chapter 12, verse number 1. He says, "I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service." So first, we must come to the point where it's reasonable. And then I want to give you the second thought. You have to re-surrender. There are some of us in here, we've gotten saved. We maybe have lived for Jesus for a time, but we must resurrender. I was thinking about this, and he tells us this, that it needs to be a daily surrender. You pick up your cross daily. I don't know about you, but every day I don't always look forward to living for Jesus. I know you're the preacher. You're supposed to like get up and be all smiles. When you walk in the church and there's water, I was like, I just want to go home. All right. There are days where I don't know if you're ever like this. I'm just not feeling it. I am just not feeling it today. Some of you maybe you're like that, where like you're that grumpy kind of person. You're like, I'm just not feeling it. Feeling what? Being nice, being anything. You're just, but you resurrender. Jesus is calling us to re-surrender to Him. If you read the book of Acts and you hear about these sold out Christians, these Christians who you're like, they did amazing things. Why was it? It was because they were sold out. But a lot of us love to hear stories about people, but we don't want to pay the price. You hear about these athletes who did these awesome things, but you don't want to pay the price that they paid. You just want it handed to you. You don't want to put all the hours of work in. You don't want to put, you hear about these people and they start a business and you're like, man, I wish I could start a business. Well, go do it. But you just don't want to because you don't want to put all the work, all the hours, all the time. It's easy to say that. There's a lot of Christians who would be like, man, I want to be that sold out Christian. You must not think it's the most reasonable decision. Because if we got to that place where man, this is the most reasonable thing I could do, is be the kind of Christian who is completely sold out to Jesus Christ. I read a news article this morning about a preacher in Seattle, and he was arrested and put into jail because he was reading the Bible. And they made it where you couldn't publicly read the Bible. And he's like, I don't care if you make that rule. And he went out and he read the Bible. And now this happened a while ago. But this is the kind of persecution and things that are going to come in our world. If we don't decide that we're totally surrendered, we're going to just fall to any pressure that comes in the world. And so we need to resurrender daily to Jesus Christ. Each day when we wake up, we are going to surrender. And then I want you to read this, Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. In Christianity, it is one of the places where in our culture, and a lot of other things that you do, you want someone to push you, to stretch you, to share truth. Can you imagine if you get a personal trainer and they're like, hey, you really don't need to work out. You look great. I know what that scale says. It's probably not accurate. You're really good. No one wants that. If you hey, I want a personal trainer, you want them to tell you the truth. You want them to push you. You don't want to be the same. And I would just tell you, in our culture and day and age, people are swarming to churches, to pastors who are saying, you guys are all good. There's this verse in here in Philippians chapter 4. And he says this in Philippians 4:4. It reads, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say, rejoice. A sold-out Christian will rejoice in God in all situations. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that everything is found in Him, that He's in control. You see, when you start deciding a situation is for you to decide whether you rejoice in that. Whether you have whether you have joy. In Habakkuk, he said this, Habakkuk 3:17, you don't need to turn there. He says, although the fig shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. He's like, if the crop doesn't come, it doesn't throw its fruit this year. I don't know if you guys have looked around. We're in like one of the biggest droughts in our area that I can ever remember since I've lived up here. Like, there's like 2 green yards in our neighborhood, and Kathy's will be driving by. They'll be like, look at their grass. I'm like, yeah. Can you imagine how much water they're using? Kind of justify my lack of green grass. But I will say we haven't spent very much money mowing this year. Why? Because it's dead. But if you drive down some of these like back roads and see the crops, they're horrible. The farmers in this area, they're going to struggle when they go to bring in the harvest. Do you know what Habakkuk said? Even if the vine doesn't bring the fruit like I want, I'm still going to rejoice and find my joy in Him. Why? Because our trust is in Him. It's not in self or what I want out of life. I wanted to bring this back to surrendered. When you get completely sold out and surrendered to Jesus, you can rejoice when you hear the words, I got cancer. Now, I'm not saying that exact moment you can. When you have that thing happen in your life, you're like, man, God, I just don't understand it. My mom, she passed away at 46, but she had gotten cancer. That's not what took her life. She had diabetes for a long time, didn't take care of that, and then she went in the hospital for a quadruple bypass. I felt like 46. I felt like I got cheated. Like she was a sweet, sweet lady. But I can rejoice in that I can trust God. I'm not saying everything that happens is He made it happen. Every time, some people are like, you have a day and no matter what you do until that day, you're going to live. I honestly, I think if you would just read the whole Bible, you would find out that that's unbiblical. Because there are some people who slept because they took communion unworthily. There were people who paid prices because decisions that they made. You shorten your life by, one, not taking care of yourself or doing things that hurts or harms your temple, decisions you make, places you put yourself. You can't come back and say, God, it's your fault in everything. But I do trust Him. Therefore, when I was at that church, and just the other day I just drove by that spot where my grandma got killed, and Kathy was in the car with me. I was quiet. I was just thinking about her. She was a sweet, amazing lady. She wouldn't take back, I don't think, what happened if she could. I mean, if she could see everything that's happened since then, all the people that have gotten saved, all the lives that were changed. My dad preaches at jails and prisons, and there's been hundreds and hundreds of people saved because of this domino effect of things that happened after that point. Would I wish that on anybody? No. But I trust Him. You can have joy if you will just surrender to Him. You can rejoice in tough situations if you will just surrender. The Christian life is meant to be surrendered. God, I surrender to your will. I surrender in rejoicing. I'm going to rejoice in these situations. And then he'll bring about that fruit of joy. And then I think about this, he says in Romans 6:11, and I'm going to be finished here this morning, Romans 6:11. It reads this in Romans 6:11. Likewise, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Reckon means, that word means to reason with oneself, to conclude from arguments. The old man, my old man died at 16 years old. That's when I got saved. Now, I'm constantly in a battle with my flesh. But when we start to reckon that, hey, I am surrendered to Jesus, I am his vessel, I'll do whatever he wants. God will do amazing things with your life. God will use you to reach people. He'll use you to make a difference. You'll lead people to Christ. You'll disciple people. You'll be a part of things. Why? Because you are just surrendered. God, here's my life. It's worth it. Later this year, there's going to be a preacher who's going to come, and he's a preacher, but also his field is finances and things like that. And so he tries to encourage people to, prepare for retirement. And one of the things, if you can convince people of the value of that, is like if you're young and you start placing some money back for retirement, it just grows exponentially. But when you're like 40 and 50 and 60, I don't know if any of you guys are like me, but you're like a procrastinator. I always tell Kathy my big retirement plan is Walmart greeter. And so if any of you see me in there one day, make sure you dab me up. Hey, Pastor Mike. But he tries to teach you of the value of like doing some, but the only way to convince you of that is you have to like see the value in it. Otherwise, you won't do it. If you don't see the value in something, you just won't do it. Some people could convince you of the value of taking care of your body, of health. There was this guy, he used to come to a church I was a part of, and he went and spoke at schools about dental health. And you're like, what a weird thing. Well, he had a tooth that had gotten infected. He didn't go to the doctor. He ended up having a stroke. His life was like, he lost his job, his life was destroyed, all because he didn't take care of. So he saw great value in brushing your teeth, I guess, and going to the dentist, and I hope everyone in here sees value in that. But he tried to convince kids and young people of the value of it. I shouldn't even have to do that much to convince you. What Jesus did for you, what he did for me, he's worth it. He's worth you being totally sold out. If you have been living recently not sold out to Jesus, not surrendered, let's resurrender this morning. You're not going to have revival unless you're surrendered to Jesus. You're not going to live for Jesus unless you're surrendered to Jesus. You're not going to read your Bible. You're not going to pray. You're not going to pass out tracts. You're not going to give if you're not surrendered. It shouldn't be, hey, I'm going to convince you of the value of doing things. I'm really just trying to convince you of the value of Him. And He's worth it. And then I don't have to convince you, hey, you should give, or you should do this, or you should do that. Why? Because He's worth it. And we're surrendered to Him. And so this morning, what we need to do is we need to look at our hearts and our lives. And you're like, Jesus, am I really surrendered to you? Am I really sold out? Now, I want to tell you, there are some people in here, I have them in my family, you live a delusional life. You do. You think you're really surrendered. I have family members who are they're like, maybe it's health related, and they think they're doing good because they're only going to McDonald's once a day. They think they're doing good. In their minds, they think. I'm not asking you to be delusional. This is what King David said to God. Search me and try me. What's God want for your life? Don't compare yourself to your family because you might be doing better than your family. Don't compare yourself to the people you go to church with because you might be better than the people you go to church with. They say the Bible says they that compare themselves among themselves are not wise. Jesus, search my heart, my mind, see if there be any wicked way in me. Am I surrendered to you? Let's bow our heads and pray.